When spring comes, there is always more work to do. Who cleaned the yard? Who was tending the vegetable garden? And who cleaned up the summer kitchen, which stood a little away from the house? Since I was far from agriculture, I always ended up cleaning the garage or helping in other places. My mother-in-law, Margaret Adams, was busy in her favorite vegetable garden. As I'd approached the window overlooking the vegetable garden, I saw her standing on the path, leaning on a shovel, chatting with someone. From my vantage point, I couldn't see who it was, so I opened the window and sat in a chair to observe. Margaret was always full of energy when she worked in the garden. The fresh smell of earth and blooming flowers filled the air, and I could hear the birds chirping nearby. Her garden was her pride, filled with rows of brightly colored vegetables and blooming flowers. I knew from her speech that this neighbor was Paul, a young man who had dropped out of school early and attended vocational school for a while. Paul was a somewhat overgrown boy who never quite found his way, and his routine mostly revolved around the house, yard, and village store. Margaret was a widow, and perhaps in that respect she was a little lonely. In conversation with Paul, she seemed cheerful, giggling and shaking her head. "Paul, you're still young," she said modestly. "You'll find yourself a good woman and everything will be fine." I couldn't make out Paul's reply, but whatever it was, Margaret laughed again. She looked around warily. "I'm a mistress? Paul, I don't understand you. Are you serious? What if your mother finds out and gives you a scandal?" she said, though her tone seemed to soften. "I'll think about it, but you have to remember that I have a daughter and son-in-law here. And if your mother finds out about it, the whole village will know." With those words, she picked up the shovel and headed toward the barn. I quickly slipped out of the kitchen window and quietly went back into the house. Later, Margaret was sitting in the living room watching TV, but after a while she got up, got dressed, said she was going to a neighbor's house. She went out and I watched her standing by the corner of the summer kitchen until Paul came over. They walked in together and I stepped back to the window, which I left slightly ajar. It was beginning to be evening, and the air was cooling as the sun lowered in the sky. The houses around me seemed so quiet, as if they too were holding their breath. I couldn't see them since they hadn't turned on the lights, but I could hear their voices. "So, are you ready, Paul?" asked Margaret quietly. A pause followed before Paul replied, "Yes." Then there was the creaking of the couch, which grew louder and louder and finally fell silent. After about 10 minutes, it quieted down. I didn't wait for round 2 of this invisible movie. I quietly retired to the house, feeling a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Margaret returned half an hour later and went straight to the bathroom. She looked flushed and her hair was slightly disheveled, but she didn't say anything to me, and I didn't bother to ask. I heard the sound of water pouring and wondered if she was trying to wash off what had just happened.